Hi, I'm Bob Tabor with LearnVisualStudio.net. You know, whenever I try to learn a new technology, I have to get a feel for how all the major pieces fit together. So when I first heard that you could create Windows Store apps using HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, I asked myself, how is this even possible? I mean, is your HTML, CSS, and JavaScript somehow compiled into an executable, much like how, for example, C# is compiled into a .NET assembly? Or is the execution environment or the hosting environment simply Internet Explorer 10.0 just in like full screen mode? But if that's the case, then how is it possible to allow apps to access the file system or a webcam like you can do in a real Windows 8 app? So I wrestled with these sorts of things, and fortunately, after enough reading and watching presentations online, I was able to satisfy my own curiosity, and I figured out how all these pieces of the puzzle kind of fit together, at least at a high level. So in an effort to save you a little bit of time up front, I figured I wanted to talk about this just briefly. The key to understanding this and how it works is understanding that there are two execution environments. Obviously, you can open web pages with HTML, CSS, and JavaScript using Internet Explorer 10 or any other web browser. You can load these files off the internet, or you can load them off your local machine, as we do from time to time in order to test our apps. So when you use Internet Explorer, your code executes in a web context. All this means is that the code has limited permissions. There are things your code cannot do because it would be potentially harmful to the consumer's computer. So you can't access files off the hard drive, you can't delete files, you can't access certain devices attached to the computer, and so on. So when you write HTML, CSS, and JavaScript for a Windows Store app, it'll be executed in a process that's called the WWA host.exe. And just to watch this actually run, let's run our Contoso Cookbook app one more time. Without shutting it down, I'm going to go back to the start page, back to the desktop, and then I'm going to right-click in the bar at the bottom and select Task Manager and go to Details. And you have to have your app running in order to see this. There's this file here at the bottom, wwa host.exe. Now, there's not a lot that you can really do with it, but this process basically has the same HTML rendering engine and the same JavaScript engine as Internet Explorer 10.0, but it runs in a local context, which means that your JavaScript has greater access to the resources of the system. And it does this by providing you access to something called the Windows Runtime Library, which gives you access to the Windows runtime, what ultimately is running your app. And that provides secure access to system resources like user data, to devices like the webcam, to the file system, to any communications across the internet, to the tiles that we're going to work with later, here on the start page, and so on. However, JavaScript that runs in the local context is also restricted from certain operations that might potentially be harmful. So, for example, you can't just run your app and then load JavaScript from remote places across the internet and then try to execute those. In other words, if there was a JavaScript library that you wanted to use in your app, or if you wrote some JavaScript in a file and you want to access it, then you have to include it as part of your app that will be distributed. You can't access that JavaScript from a remote web server, nor can you even access the web for accessing data in an AJAX-style operation in the same way that you could in the web context. Now, fortunately, there are ways in the local context using the Windows Runtime API to safely access the web and so on. So the Windows Runtime API, or library as I called it earlier, can be accessed by your JavaScript code through the Windows namespace. And just to see this kind of working, what I want to do is put our Contoso Cookbook on the side for just a moment. We're going to create a little sandbox to play in. So I'm going to go File, New Project. In the New Project dialog, I want to make sure that I have JavaScript Windows Store templates selected on the left. And then this time I'm going to choose the blank app template in the center and rename this to Hello World. And we can make some changes in here and learn a little bit more about how all this works through this lesson and the next lesson. And let me Get that a little bit larger here. Okay, so you can see that in this particular case, this app doesn't really do a whole lot. Let's just run it real quick. All it does is just says content goes here. Okay, so not a lot of interesting, but it is the blank app template, right? So we wouldn't expect a whole lot going on here. But what this does do is show us this default.js file. This default.js is automatically added to this project template and the Contoso Cookbook project template, and we'll be looking at that in subsequent lessons. But here at the very top, you can see how we're able to access the Windows Runtime API by working with the Windows namespace. So in JavaScript code, we're able to access the Windows namespace. In this particular instance, we're accessing a child namespace called the application model, and then another namespace called activation. And so basically this default.js file, it contains code that specifies how the app behaves whenever the app is started. This file contains code for handling your app's lifecycle, which we're going to talk about at length when we get to Lab 6 in this series a little bit later on. But in a nutshell, the app lifecycle begins when the app starts, and it ends when the app is closed permanently. So if a user wants to switch to another app, your app would be suspended. Now it's still in memory, but in a suspended animated state, I guess you could say. But then at some point, if the user were to keep opening new apps, and the computer needed some more memory, and yours hasn't been open in a while, then it will deactivate, or rather remove your app completely from memory. But as a programmer, you can choose to store the state of the app right before your app goes into suspended or deactivated mode. And again, we're going to talk about that at length a little bit later. But as we look at this default.js file, that's what most of all this code here is actually attempting to do, is to handle certain events that occur during the life cycle of the app, specifically whenever the app is, as you can see here, activated. And we'll learn more about that a little bit as well. But what I want to point out here is that you can see that we can actually reference the Windows Runtime API. If we were to try to run this in a web context, it simply wouldn't work. And then I think the other interesting thing to note is how they have aliased many of the namespaces that will be used throughout the course of the application by simply setting a variable to that class or namespace, all right? And so you can see that it's used later on throughout the body of this, even if we don't know what that code does. So now it really just saves them a bunch of typing. They don't have to type out this full namespace. All they got to do is just type activation. They can get to the same functionality inside the Windows Runtime API. All right, but the point here that I really want to make is that when you think about the execution environment for your code, think local context, think reduced permission, or actually extended permissions. You can do more things than you could in the web context. Think WWA host.exe. Think I now have access to the Windows Runtime API, so I can get to cool things like the webcam, the file system, and so on. You think about the Windows dot whatever namespace. So anything that deals with interacting or integrating with the rest of Windows. Webcams, the search charm, or any of the charms that we're going to look at later throughout the series, okay? You name it. This is the domain of the Windows Runtime. It's one of two libraries that we get access to when we run in a local context. So hopefully that answers the questions about execution and the hosting of your app. But what about the styling and the presentation? I mean, even in this simple app, we don't get a whole lot here, but we get the colors and the fonts. And when we saw our Contoso Cookbook, as we created it from the grid app template, we saw that there was motion, animation, there was a distinctive look, there was a color scheme, and so on. How do Windows Store apps get their distinctive look and feel? Or rather, how do you implement the Microsoft design language and implement the Windows personality, the animations, the distinctive grouped lists of tiles, and so on? So, what happened was, when they were sitting down to design all this and develop it all, they wanted to not only make any toolkits that are already available on the internet. So like jQuery and Dojo. They wanted to make those available to you as you build your applications. They also felt the need to create a new JavaScript library that could embody the Windows personality that we just spoke about and let you build Windows apps with the same set of common look and feel, common controls that you would expect to find in any of the in any Windows 8 app. So Microsoft created the Windows library for JavaScript. That's the second API that you now have access to, or that helps you build applications for Windows 8. It's better known as WinJS, and it provides a bunch of features, and we're going to look at them at length in the next lesson. But first of all, it gives you a number of style sheets. If we were to take a look at the references here and just kind of drill down, you can see there's a reference to this Windows library for JavaScript 1.0, and there are some subfolders for the CSS and JavaScript. And I don't want to go into a lot of depth about these right now. Some of this will come out as we go through the Contoso Cookbook Labs, but you can see that there is a UI dark.css theme, and that is mostly responsible for giving us the look and the feel of a Windows 8 app in using just CSS. Pretty cool. So there are style sheets that that give us that Microsoft Design Language theme. There are core features, and they are available through this base.js, and they allow you to create things like namespaces and classes, things that are not built into JavaScript, but are helpful whenever you're building these sorts of apps, and we're going to look at them in the next lesson. It also gives you asynchronicity through promises. It gives you a new way to do DOM queries, document object model queries. So I need to find a certain div tag in my document. I could use get element by ID, but is there an easier way to do that? Well, there are some ways in the WinJS to do that. That are little shortcuts. Then there's also the app model like we looked at, so I'm talking about things like the process lifecycle. So it provides some additional functionality, a wrapper in some cases around features of what you get in the Windows runtime. It also provides a data model, templating, binding, lists that are observable, or in other words, that they notify whenever there's a change to the list. So it's like an array on steroids. Okay, we'll talk about that a little bit later. Then there is a controls model that's available through WinJS. So it's not just the styling and the behavior of the Windows controls themselves, but also the ability to define custom controls and apply them to div tags. We'll look at that in the next lesson. And then obviously there's the animations. So they call these personality controls sometimes in presentations. Things like the list view that we saw in the Contoso Cookbook, the flip view, the app bar that we'll use in the Contoso Cookbook, and so on. And then there's also other utilities and helpers that'll pop up from time to time. Now technically, you don't even have to use WinJS at all. We could delete that and remove that from our application and still create a Windows Store app. It's simply JavaScript and CSS, and there's no magic under the hood, so to speak. You could ignore it, but it is really extremely helpful. So, you could also pick and choose the parts of WinJS that you want to use. So if you want to use a different JavaScript library that you're already familiar with, for like DOM access, say you're so familiar with jQuery that you would prefer to use it, or if you want to use like the templating of a JavaScript library called Mustache or any of the other ones that are available, you can use it. The creators of this whole system of being able to use HTML, JavaScript, and CSS to create Windows Store apps wanted to keep the spirit that you see alive in web development available as you're building Windows Store apps. So it might be helpful at this point if we learn a little bit more about WinJS and some of the things it can do before we really dive deeper into creating the Contoso Cookbook. So what I want to do in the next lesson is extend this Hello World app that we started here to demonstrate the core features of WinJS, like creating namespaces and classes, as well as some of the features that we're going to come to rely on, like binding to lists, creating templates, and so on. So we'll do that in the very next lesson. We'll see you there. Thank you.